Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The Causeway. I've worked for almost a decade as a field technician for a state wildlife agency, doing waterfowl and shorebird surveys along the Atlantic coast, much of it in remote salt marsh and barrier island terrain that requires boat access, and, in several locations, walking long tidal causeways that are only passable during specific windows around low tide. The work is solitary by necessity, since most survey routes only accommodate one technician at a time without disturbing the bird populations being counted, and it routinely puts me in genuinely isolated coastal terrain at odd hours, since shorebird activity peaks around dawn and dusk regardless of how inconvenient that is for a survey schedule. Over the years, I've developed a real comfort with that solitude, the specific quiet of marsh terrain before sunrise, broken only by the occasional call of a night heron or the distant sound of waves on the seaward side of whichever barrier island I'm working that week. This was 4 years ago, a survey route along a barrier island system in coastal Georgia, accessed by a tidal causeway that connects to the mainland only during a roughly 4-hour window each day, narrow enough and low enough that the timing has to be respected carefully, since getting caught on the wrong side when the tide turns means either an extended, uncomfortable wait or, in the worst case, a genuinely dangerous attempt to wade or swim a channel that fills quickly and unpredictably with strong currents. The agency takes that timing seriously enough that every technician working that route carries detailed tide tables and is required to log departure and return times for each crossing, a level of procedural caution that reflects just how unforgiving that particular stretch of coastline can be for anyone who misjudges it. I'd done that specific route maybe a dozen times before, comfortable with the timing and the terrain, conducting a pre-dawn survey that required crossing the causeway in full darkness to reach the island before first light, when shorebird activity is at its most representative for an accurate count. The causeway itself runs close to 3/4 of a mile across open marsh and tidal flat, exposed on both sides with no real cover, the kind of terrain where a headlamp beam carries a long way in the absence of any other light source, since there's no tree canopy or structure anywhere along the route to interrupt or scatter the light. About halfway across, with the tide still well out and a good 90 minutes before it would start turning, my headlamp caught movement on the flat to my left, something low and pale moving with a deliberateness that didn't match the usual quick, erratic movement of the marsh birds I'd see scattering ahead of my approach during a normal crossing. I stopped and swept the light more carefully across that section of flat, and the movement stopped as well, leaving me looking at what appeared to be a stretch of entirely empty mud and scattered marsh grass, the kind of total stillness that, after a clearly observed movement just seconds earlier, felt more unsettling than if I'd simply seen nothing at all from the start. I want to be precise about what I saw, because I've gone over it many times since trying to find the most accurate description rather than the most dramatic one. The shape, in the brief window before it went still, had a pale, indistinct quality that I initially attributed to distance and the limitations of headlamp illumination at range, low to the ground, moving with what looked like a crouched or low-slung gait rather than anything upright, covering ground faster than I would have expected from the brief glimpse I got before it stopped. I estimated, as best I could under those conditions, that whatever I'd seen was roughly the size of a large dog, though the proportions seemed off in a way I couldn't immediately articulate, longer through the body relative to its apparent height than any dog breed I'm familiar with a kind of low, level profile that didn't rise and fall the way a four-legged gait typically would even at a careful glance. I should mention, too, that the marsh that morning was otherwise behaving entirely as expected, with the ordinary background chorus of clapper rails and the occasional distant splash of fish working the tidal flats, none of which paused or changed in any way I noticed during either sighting, which struck me afterward as worth mentioning, since a genuinely alarming predator moving through that habitat might reasonably be expected to disturb at least some of the smaller wildlife in its immediate vicinity. The fact that the marsh's ordinary soundscape continued entirely undisturbed made me wonder, later, whether whatever I'd seen was simply a known, unremarkable presence as far as the rest of that ecosystem was concerned, however unfamiliar it remained to me. I continued walking, slower than before, watching that section of flat as closely as the causeway's narrow path allowed, my pulse noticeably elevated despite knowing, rationally, that I'd seen plenty of strange shapes over the years that turned out to be perfectly ordinary wildlife, once properly identified. I saw nothing further for several minutes, long enough that I'd started to genuinely relax, attributing the entire incident to a large raccoon or perhaps a feral hog, both of which are present on that island and both of which can produce a low, pale-seeming shape under headlamp illumination depending on coat condition and angle. Then, closer to the island side of the crossing, my light caught the same low, pale shape again, this time on my right, closer to the causeway itself than the first sighting had been, close enough that I could make out, even briefly, something that looked like an unusually elongated head or snout profile before it dropped from sight into a drainage channel that cuts through that section of marsh. The proximity of that second sighting, considerably closer to the actual causeway path than the first had been, did more to unsettle me than the initial encounter itself, since it suggested either two separate animals working roughly the same stretch of marsh, or one animal that had moved with considerable speed and purpose to close that distance during the several minutes I'd spent walking and watching in between. I finished the crossing at a faster pace than usual, reached the island, and completed my survey with the specific, hyper-aware alertness that follows any unsettling experience. Though nothing further happened during the actual count itself, the shorebirds along the island's tidal flats behaving entirely normally despite whatever had been moving along the causeway behind me. I logged my counts as thoroughly as I always do, conscious even at the time of a slight, deliberate effort to focus harder than usual on the actual work in front of me as a way of pushing the earlier unease into the background until I had the mental space to properly process it. The island itself, once I'd settled into the familiar rhythm of the count, felt entirely ordinary, the same stretch of dune and tidal flat I'd surveyed a dozen times before without incident, which made the contrast with the causeway crossing only a few hundred yards behind me feel even sharper in retrospect. The return crossing several hours later, in full daylight with the tide appropriately low, produced nothing unusual, and I spent that walk examining the mud on both sides of the causeway as carefully as I could without straying off the maintained path, looking for any tracks that might explain what I'd seen, conscious the entire time of how different the same stretch of marsh felt under full sun compared to the version I'd crossed in darkness that morning. Daylight has a way of making even genuinely strange experiences feel more manageable, more easily filed away as something to think about later rather than something requiring immediate explanation, and by the time I'd reached the mainland side of the causeway, I'd largely talked myself into treating the whole thing as an interesting story rather than a genuine source of ongoing concern, an attitude that lasted right up until the conversation with my senior colleague gave me reason to reconsider. I found tracks, eventually, in a stretch of softer mud near where the second sighting had occurred, but they were frustratingly ambiguous in exactly the way these things tend to be. A series of impressions that could plausibly have been a large raccoon, an otter, or something else entirely, distorted enough by the soft, water-saturated mud that I couldn't confidently rule out any of those mundane explanations despite genuinely wanting to find something more conclusive one way or the other. I photographed what I found, the same way I document any unusual field observation as a matter of professional habit, though the images, when I reviewed them later that day, suffered from the same ambiguity as the tracks themselves, the soft mud having already begun slumping and losing definition in the hours between my crossing and my return. I did notice, alongside the more ambiguous prints, a continuous shallow groove running for several feet through the softest section of mud, roughly parallel to what would have been the shape's direction of travel, a feature that didn't match any track pattern I was familiar with, and that I couldn't confidently attribute to anything beyond speculation. I want to walk through the explanations I considered most seriously before concluding that none of them fully satisfied me. A large feral hog, common enough on barrier islands throughout that region, was my first and most persistent candidate, since hogs can appear pale under headlamp light, depending on coloration and mud coating, and they're certainly capable of moving with speed across that kind of terrain. But feral hogs are loud, vocal animals that grunt and snort almost constantly while foraging, and what I observed produced no vocalization at all across either sighting, a silence that struck me as increasingly significant the more I turned the encounter over afterward. I also considered river otter, which inhabits that marsh system in healthy numbers and does move with a low, sinuous gait that could plausibly account for some of what I saw, though otters are considerably smaller than the shape I observed and typically travel in family groups rather than alone, neither of which match my own impression in the moment. I mentioned the experience to a more senior technician who'd worked that same barrier island system for over 20 years, a woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of the local ecology and a reputation for blunt, unromantic assessments of anything reported by newer staff. The kind of person other technicians went to specifically because she wouldn't humor an exaggerated account or sugarcoat a dismissal if she thought one was warranted. I expected her to offer a confident explanation involving some known species I hadn't considered, possibly a nutria or an unusually large raccoon, both of which she'd corrected my identification of more than once during my earlier years on the job. Instead, she asked, very specifically, where on the Causeway the second sighting had occurred, a level of precision that told me she had some particular reason for asking before I'd even finished describing the location, naming the drainage channel herself before I'd gotten around to specifying it. When I told her, she said that section of Causeway had a quiet reputation among longtime staff, something she'd heard about from technicians who'd worked there even before her own tenure began, of unexplained shapes seen during pre-dawn crossings. Always low, always pale, always near that same drainage channel where I'd lost sight of mine. She said she'd had one experience of her own, years earlier, that she'd never formally reported, similar enough to mine in its basic shape that she felt comfortable sharing it once I'd described my own first, treating the conversation as a kind of mutual disclosure that neither of us would have initiated without the other having already broken the ice. She told me her sighting had also occurred during a pre-dawn crossing, also near that drainage channel, occurring during her second season on the job close to 2 decades before our conversation, and had included a detail I hadn't mentioned to her yet myself, a faint, dragging sound accompanying the movement, distinct from footfall, that she'd never been able to attribute to any animal behavior she was aware of despite her own considerable expertise in regional wildlife. When I confirmed I'd noticed something similar during my own second sighting, a kind of soft, irregular drag that I'd attributed at the time to the shape's gait through soft mud, she nodded slowly, the particular nod of someone having a long-held private account quietly corroborated rather than introduced for the first time, and I could see, even in the dim light of the break room where we were having this conversation, a visible easing in her posture that I read as genuine relief. She didn't have a theory she was willing to commit to, beyond a general acknowledgement that Barrier Island and salt marsh ecosystems sometimes harbor genuinely undocumented or poorly understood wildlife behavior, given how little research attention these specific habitats receive relative to their actual biodiversity. A point she made with the particular authority of someone who'd spent her entire career working in exactly the kind of overlooked terrain that doesn't attract the same scientific scrutiny as more accessible inland ecosystems. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that local fishing communities in that region have their own informal folklore about strange shapes seen in the marsh at dawn and dusk, stories she'd always assumed were embellished accounts of known wildlife until her own experience gave her less confidence in that easy dismissal, recalling specifically an older waterman who'd once described, unprompted, almost the exact same low, pale, dragging presence near a different causeway several islands south of ours. I've continued working that survey route in the years since, including dozens more pre-dawn crossings of that same causeway, and I haven't seen anything like it again, though I notice myself moving a bit faster than strictly necessary through that particular stretch near the drainage channel, a habit I've never fully examined or tried to break, and one that several newer technicians I've since trained on that same route have noticed and asked me about, without my ever volunteering the full explanation unless they ask directly the way I once asked my own senior colleague. I still believe, on balance, that the most likely explanation involves some known species behaving in a way that simply doesn't match my prior expectations, distorted by distance, darkness, and the limitations of headlamp illumination over open, featureless terrain, the same kind of perceptual distortion that accounts for the vast majority of strange wildlife sightings reported by even experienced field staff. That belief is sincere, and I want to be clear that I hold it as my actual working theory rather than a polite hedge I'm offering for the sake of sounding reasonable. What keeps me from fully accepting that explanation, though, is the same thing that always keeps these accounts from settling comfortably into the mundane. The independent corroboration from someone with 2 decades more field experience than I had at the time, describing a detail, that faint dragging sound, that I hadn't shared with her before she offered it herself. Coincidence can explain a lot in isolated experiences. It has a much harder time explaining why 2 trained observers, working the same remote causeway years apart, would each independently reach for the same specific, unusual detail to describe something neither of us ever managed to identify, photograph, or fully resolve, in a stretch of marsh that, by all accounts circulating quietly among the staff who've worked it longest, has been producing some version of this same story for considerably longer than either of our careers. I've thought, too, about why that particular stretch of marsh, out of the dozens of similarly remote tidal causeways and barrier island crossings I've worked over the years, seems to be the one location with this kind of accumulated, multi-witness history attached to it. The agency manages survey routes across a considerable stretch of coastline, many of them just as isolated and just as dependent on pre-dawn crossings during specific tide windows, yet I've never heard a comparable account attached to any other route, which makes the specificity of this one location feel more significant than it might if similar stories circulated evenly across the entire coastal survey system. Whatever explanation eventually accounts for what my colleague and I both experienced, it seems tied to that particular drainage channel and that particular stretch of causeway in a way that doesn't generalize easily to the broader habitat type. I've since trained 3 newer technicians on that same survey route, and I've made a deliberate choice each time to mention the experience only if they bring up something unusual themselves first, the same approach my senior colleague took with me, treating it as information that's more useful and more credible when it confirms something a person has already independently noticed rather than something that primes their expectations before they've even made their first crossing. None of the 3 I've trained so far have reported anything out of the ordinary, which I take as a reasonably encouraging sign, though I recognize that a sample of 3 crossings each, spread across a year or 2 of employment, isn't a particularly large basis for any confident conclusion either way. For now, the explanation I keep coming back to, the one that lets me keep doing this job without dwelling on it more than is healthy, is simply that the natural world still holds genuine gaps in our understanding, even in habitats as well studied on paper as Atlantic coastal marsh, and that 2 careful, trained observers stumbling independently into the edge of one of those gaps, years apart, on the same quarter-mile of tidal causeway, isn't necessarily evidence of anything beyond how much we, still don't know about the places we spend our working lives moving through. The claim. I've worked as a geologist doing mineral exploration fieldwork for almost 18 years, mostly in the Mountain West, spending entire summers in remote terrain checking old mining claims, sampling rock, and occasionally staying overnight in or near abandoned mine workings when the logistics of a survey require it. The job has taken me into more old adits, shafts, and collapsed workings than I could accurately count, across Nevada, Colorado, Montana, and a handful of other states with a long enough mining history to leave that kind of infrastructure scattered through the backcountry, much of it undocumented beyond county-level claim records that haven't been meaningfully updated in decades. I want to establish, before describing what happened, that I am not someone inclined towards superstition about old mines. The work requires a clear-headed, methodical approach to genuinely dangerous environments: bad air, unstable ground, the real possibility of a collapse, and you don't last in this field if you let imagination get ahead of careful assessment. I've spent more nights camped near old workings than most people would find comfortable, and until the summer I'm about to describe, none of it had ever produced anything beyond ordinary backcountry experience. The kind of strange noises and unexplained wildlife encounters that come standard with extended remote fieldwork, and that most experienced field geologists learn to treat as background texture rather than anything requiring close attention. This was 5 years ago, a survey contract in a remote part of central Nevada, checking a cluster of old silver claims from the late 1800s that a client was considering reopening for modern exploration. The claim sat in a narrow canyon, maybe 12 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by a rough four-wheel drive track that took the better part of 2 hours to navigate even in good conditions, the kind of remoteness that meant my field partner and I were entirely on our own for the better part of a week at a time between supply runs. With no cell coverage anywhere in the canyon and a satellite communicator reserved strictly for genuine emergencies. We set up a base camp near the mouth of the canyon, close to the largest of the old workings, a substantial adit that ran several hundred feet into the mountain before terminating in a collapsed section that had clearly been unstable for decades. Based on the timber condition and the visible rubble pile we could see from the entrance using our headlamps during initial assessment. The canyon walls on either side rose steeply enough that direct sunlight only reached our camp for a handful of hours around midday, giving the whole site a cool, shadowed quality even in the height of a Nevada summer, the kind of microclimate that made the evenings feel longer and the darkness, once it fell, feel more total than it would have in more open terrain. Our job didn't require going deep into any of the workings. Surface sampling and structural assessment from the entrances was sufficient for the contract, but it did require spending considerable time in close proximity to the mine openings, cataloging timber condition, air quality, and visible mineralization at the portals. Work that kept us at or near the adit mouth for several hours most days regardless of where we chose to actually sleep at night. On our third night in camp, while after dark, my field partner Dana and I were both still awake, going over the day's sample logs by lantern light, when we heard what sounded unmistakably like metal striking rock coming from somewhere inside the main adit, maybe 150 yards from our tents. A single, hard strike, then a pause, then two more in quick succession, the unmistakable sound of a pick or hammer working stone, a sound either of us would recognize instantly given how much of our professional lives have been spent around exactly that kind of tool use, both from our own field work and from years of being around active small-scale mining operations during prior contracts. We looked at each other for a long moment before either of us said anything, both running through the same obvious explanations. Another party working the same claims without our knowledge, possibly an unpermitted small-scale miner working the old vein illegally, which does happen occasionally in remote claims with murky modern ownership. particularly in areas where county-level enforcement is thin and the nearest sheriff's office is well over an hour away, even under good road conditions. We grabbed headlamps and walked together toward the added entrance, calling out as we approached the way you would to announce your presence to anyone working inside, getting no response beyond the echo of our own voices off the canyon walls, which in that narrow terrain carried with an unsettling clarity that made the silence afterward feel more pronounced than it probably would have in more open country. The striking sound continued intermittently as we approached, stopping entirely by the time we reached the portal itself, a timing that struck both of us as strange even in the moment, before we'd had any chance to process the rest of what was happening. We stood at the entrance, headlamps sweeping the visible section of tunnel, finding nothing, no light, no equipment, no sign of another party's presence beyond the original century-old timber and rail remnants that had been there since the mine's active period, rusted and partially buried in places where the floor had settled unevenly over the decades. The tunnel beyond the first 100 feet curved out of sight before reaching the collapsed section, and neither of us was willing to go further in the dark to check beyond that curve, both for safety reasons given the documented instability and, I'll admit honestly, because neither of us particularly wanted to, a hesitation that felt entirely reasonable in the moment and that I've never second-guessed since. We went back to camp, agreed to check the access road in the morning for any vehicle tracks that would explain another party's presence, and went to bed uneasy, but still operating under the assumption that some mundane explanation existed even if we hadn't found it yet. The kind of working assumption that field professionals default to almost automatically as a way of staying functional in genuinely uncertain circumstances. The striking sound returned twice more that night, each time for several minutes, each time stopping before we worked up the nerve to check again. And we got very little actual sleep despite the exhaustion of a full field day behind us, lying awake in our separate tents listening to the same intermittent sound without either of us calling out to the other, each apparently assuming the other might already be asleep and not wanting to be the one to break that assumption. In the morning, we found no fresh vehicle tracks on the access road beyond our own, which had been the only set of tire marks since a rain 3 days earlier had washed the road clean, a detail we confirmed by walking the full length of the rough track back toward the canyon mouth before resuming our actual field work for the day. We walked the full length of the canyon looking for any sign of foot traffic or camp from another party, finding nothing, no fire ring, no discarded equipment, no flattened vegetation suggesting anyone had bedded down anywhere nearby recently. Whatever had been working that rock the night before had left no physical evidence of its presence beyond the sound itself, which by daylight felt almost easier to dismiss, the way most things do once the sun is up and the ordinary business of fieldwork reasserts itself over whatever unease the previous night produced. The pattern repeated on 2 more nights that week, always intermittent, always from somewhere inside that same adit, never accompanied by light or voice or any other sign of human presence beyond the sound of metal on stone. On the second of those additional nights, I made a deliberate decision to time the intervals using my watch, partly out of genuine scientific habit and partly, I think, because having a concrete task to perform made the experience feel marginally more manageable. The striking came in clusters of 2 to 4 distinct hits, separated by pauses ranging from roughly 90 seconds to just over 4 minutes, with no discernible pattern to the timing that I could identify, continuing intermittently for close to 45 minutes before stopping for the remainder of that particular night. By the third occurrence, Dana, who I should mention has close to 15 years of her own field experience and is not someone prone to dramatic interpretation, suggested we relocate our camp further down the canyon, away from direct sight line to the adit mouth, a suggestion I agreed with immediately despite neither of us articulating exactly what we thought we were avoiding. We moved our tents roughly 400 yards down canyon the following morning, citing practical reasons to each other, better wind protection, more level ground. That were technically true, but that both of us understood, without saying so directly, weren't the actual motivation behind the move. We finished the survey contract without further nighttime incidents after relocating camp, completed our sampling and structural assessment during daylight hours as planned, and wrapped the project without ever resolving what we'd heard those first 3 nights. I filed the experience away mentally as one of the genuinely unexplained things that happens often enough in remote fieldwork that you learn not to dwell on it too heavily, professionally speaking, even when it stays with you personally. What brought the experience back into focus, almost 2 years later, was a conversation with a retired mining engineer who'd consulted on historical claims throughout that same region for over 4 decades. Someone I'd been put in touch with for an entirely unrelated project involving different claims in a different part of the state. Over the course of an otherwise ordinary professional conversation about ground support methods and older workings, I mentioned, somewhat tentatively, the canyon and the claims by name, asking if he had any historical knowledge of the site that might be relevant to our client's renewed interest, framing the question purely in terms of engineering and historical production records rather than anything else. He went quiet for a moment, the particular quiet I'd come to recognize over the years as the specific tell of someone deciding how much to share with a colleague rather than dismiss outright, and asked, before answering my actual question, whether we'd camped anywhere near the main adit during our survey. A question that had nothing to do with what I'd actually asked him, and that immediately told me he had some specific reason for wanting to know. When I confirmed we had, he told me that claim had a documented history, going back to mining-era records he'd reviewed decades earlier in the course of his own consulting work, of reported phantom mining sounds, picks and hammers working rock with no miner present, going back to at least the 1890s, recorded in the personal diaries of at least 2 different mine operators who'd worked that claim across different ownership periods decades apart, diaries he'd come across while researching production records for an entirely unrelated valuation project years before he'd ever expected the detail to come up again in casual conversation. He said the original mining company had apparently lost several workers to a collapse in the deepest section of the adit sometime in the 1880s, an accident poorly documented even by the standards of mining records from that era, with conflicting accounts of exactly how many men had been lost and whether all the bodies had ever been recovered before the company sealed off the affected section and continued working a different part of the vein, a common enough practice historically, when recovery was judged too costly or too dangerous relative to the value of continuing to mine elsewhere on the same claim. He was careful to say he wasn't suggesting any direct connection between that accident and what either of us had heard, that he didn't have a theory and didn't particularly want one, but that the timing of the recorded phantom sounds, beginning shortly after that collapse according to the diary entries he'd reviewed, was hard to ignore once you knew the full history. I asked him whether other field crews working that claim in more recent decades had reported anything similar. He said yes, intermittently, across at least 3 separate exploration efforts he was personally aware of spanning the past 30 years, always the same basic description, striking sounds from inside the adit at night, no source ever found, no pattern to which specific nights it occurred beyond a general tendency to happen more often during the first week of any new crew's presence on site, a detail that matched our own experience precisely, since the sounds had stopped entirely once we relocated and never returned even on nights we ventured back near the original camp location to retrieve equipment. He said one of those 3 crews, working the claim roughly a decade before our own contract, had apparently abandoned their survey early specifically because of the disturbance, citing crew morale concerns in their official report without ever specifying the actual cause. A piece of institutional discretion he said he recognized immediately for what it likely was once he learned the fuller context himself years later. I asked him, finally, whether he believed there was a genuine connection between the historical accident and what multiple separate crews had reported over the decades since, or whether he thought it was simply a self-perpetuating story that each new crew unconsciously primed themselves to hear after learning the claim's reputation secondhand. He said he genuinely didn't know, and that the question had bothered him on and off for years without resolving in either direction, since at least 2 of the crews he was aware of, including ours, had reportedly gone into the survey with no prior knowledge of the historical accident or the claim's reputation at all, which undercut the simplest explanation of expectation-driven misperception without fully ruling it out either, given how easily that kind of story can circulate informally within a small professional community without any individual crew member consciously realizing they'd absorbed it beforehand. I haven't worked that particular claim since completing our original contract, though I followed its status loosely through industry channels, aware that the client ultimately decided not to pursue reopening it for reasons that, as far as I know, had nothing to do with our experience and everything to do with ordinary economic factors related to silver pricing and extraction costs at that scale. Part of me has wondered, more than once, whether a future crew working that site will hear the same thing we did, and whether they'll have access to the same historical context that eventually gave our own experience at least a partial, unsettling shape, or whether they'll simply add one more unexplained week to a list that, by the engineer's own account, already stretches back well over a century. I still do remote field work every season, still spend nights camped near old mine workings as a routine part of the job, and I haven't let one unresolved week in Central Nevada change my relationship to the work in any fundamental way. But I notice, now, a particular attentiveness in the first few nights of any new survey near historical mine workings, a kind of listening I didn't used to do, for the specific, unmistakable sound of metal striking stone from somewhere inside a tunnel that, as far as any of us have ever been able to determine, has had no living miner working inside it for well over a century, and I find myself, on those first nights, quietly grateful whenever an assignment doesn't carry the same kind of documented history that this one, as it turned out, had been carrying all along without either Dana or me having any way to know it before we'd already spent 3 nights camped within direct sight line of that at its dark, century-old mouth. Dana and I have talked about that week only a handful of times in the years since, usually briefly, usually at industry conferences when we happen to run into each other, and the conversation drifts naturally toward old fieldwork stories the way it does among people who've shared genuinely strange professional experiences together. Neither of us has ever pushed the other for a firmer theory than what we already have, which amounts to very little beyond the bare facts themselves. What we heard, when we heard it, and the fact that it stopped the moment we put 400 yards of canyon between ourselves and that particular tunnel mouth. That restraint, I think, is its own kind of professional habit, the same instinct that keeps a careful field geologist from overreaching beyond what the actual data supports, applied here to an experience that never gave either of us enough data to reach any conclusion we'd be willing to stand behind with full confidence. Dana and I have, in the years since, occasionally compared notes with other field geologists working historical claims throughout that same general region, careful never to lead the conversation toward our own specific experience until someone else has offered something first, the same cautious approach my own colleague took with me when he first shared the engineer's history. We've gathered, between us, 2 more second-hand accounts of similarly unexplained sounds reported from old workings elsewhere in central Nevada, neither one connected directly to our own claim, but similar enough in their basic shape, striking sounds, no source found, occurring most often during a crew's first week on a new site, that I've come to suspect this kind of experience is considerably more common within the profession than the relatively thin, scattered record of it would otherwise suggest, simply because so few field geologists are willing to risk their professional credibility by reporting it formally. What strikes me most, turning the whole experience over years later, is how naturally it fit into the existing rhythms of fieldwork itself rather than announcing itself as something dramatically separate from the ordinary business of the job. We didn't experience anything that interrupted our actual sampling and assessment work in any meaningful way. We simply heard something, investigated as thoroughly as conditions allowed, made a practical decision to relocate, and continued the contract to its normal conclusion. That ordinariness, the way the experience folded into routine professional decision-making rather than standing apart from it, is in some ways the detail I find hardest to convey to people who weren't there, and the detail that makes the whole account feel more credible to me now than it might if it had unfolded as something more theatrically dramatic. The Levee. I've worked for almost 15 years as a hydrologist for a regional flood control district along the lower Mississippi. Much of that time spent doing field work along the levee system itself, inspecting for seepage, erosion, and structural issues that require walking long stretches of remote levee crown, often well away from any town or developed area, in terrain that during flood season becomes some of the most isolated, water-dominated landscape in the region. The work occasionally requires overnight stays in remote inspection camps during high water events, when the district needs continuous monitoring of vulnerable sections that can't be reached quickly from a central office, a level of staffing intensity the district only mobilizes during genuinely significant flood events rather than ordinary seasonal high water. This was 6 years ago, during a major spring flood event that had pushed river levels high enough to require round-the-clock monitoring of several vulnerable levee segments, including a stretch maybe 18 miles from the nearest town, accessible by a single gravel access road that ran along the landward side of the levee itself. A road that itself occasionally required closure during the worst of the flooding when the district's own maintenance crews couldn't keep it passable fast enough, against the rising water table beneath it. I was assigned a multi-day rotation at a temporary inspection camp set up near that segment, sharing duties with one other hydrologist on alternating shifts, monitoring for the specific signs of levee distress that indicate a developing failure, boils, seepage, slumping, that require immediate escalation if spotted, since a levee failure in that section would put thousands of acres of agricultural and residential land at risk within hours. The camp itself consisted of little more than a single trailer parked on the landward berm, basic enough that most of our actual work happened out on the levee crown itself rather than at the camp, which served mainly as a place to log data, rest briefly between shifts, and stage equipment for the next inspection walk. The terrain on the river side of that levee, during high water, becomes a vast, flooded bata forest, the seasonally inundated woodland that sits between the levee and the main river channel, normally dry land that floods predictably during high water events and that, during the weeks I'm describing, had become several feet of slow-moving water threading through standing timber for as far as visibility allowed in any direction. It's an eerie landscape under the best circumstances, flooded forest stretching to the horizon with no solid ground visible anywhere on that side of the levee. Cypress and tupelo trunks rising directly out of dark, slow-moving water that reflects almost no light at night beyond what a headlamp throws directly onto its surface, and at night, with only a headlamp and the levee crown itself as a stable reference point, it takes on a quality that's hard to convey to anyone who hasn't actually worked it, a sense of being suspended at the edge of an environment that has, temporarily, stopped behaving like solid ground at all. On my second night of that rotation, doing a routine 2 a.m. walk of my assigned segment, checking for seepage along the landside toe with a flashlight, I heard what sounded like something moving through the flooded timber on the riverside, a slow, heavy splashing that suggested something considerably larger than the deer or feral hogs that sometimes get caught in the rising water and have to swim for higher ground during a flood event. I'd grown accustomed, over close to a week of rotations by that point, to the general ambient sounds of that flooded forest at night, the steady, almost imperceptible movement of water through standing timber, the occasional distant call of a night heron, the kind of background texture that becomes unremarkable after enough hours of exposure to it. This splashing was different, heavier and more deliberate than the quick, panicked movement of a stranded deer working its way toward higher ground, more like something moving with purpose rather than simply trying to escape rising water. I stopped and swept my light out over the flooded forest, finding nothing in the immediate beam, the light catching only the pale, water-stained bark of cypress trunks and the dark, slow-moving surface of the floodwater itself, though the splashing continued at irregular intervals for several minutes before going quiet. I want to emphasize that large animals moving through Bata Forest during high water isn't, on its own, an unusual thing to hear. Deer, hogs, even the occasional black bear get pushed by rising water into stranger movement patterns than they'd show under normal conditions, and any experienced levee inspector develops a working tolerance for unexplained splashing and movement out in that flooded timber during a major flood event. The kind of background uncertainty you learn to file away without much concern as simply part of the job during high water season. What made this particular instance stick with me wasn't the splashing itself, but what I heard immediately after it stopped. A low, sustained sound that I can only describe as a kind of moan, not loud, but carrying clearly across the water in the otherwise dead-still night air, lasting maybe 4 or 5 seconds before fading, with a quality to it that didn't match any animal vocalization I was familiar with from years of fieldwork in that exact ecosystem, lower and more sustained than in alligators bellow, which I have heard many times in that river system, and which has a distinctly different, more percussive quality, and entirely unlike the higher, sharper call of any wading bird species native to that habitat. I radioed my partner, who was resting at the camp trailer roughly a mile down the access road, describing what I'd heard and asking if she'd noticed anything similar during her own earlier shift. She hadn't, but she came out to join me on the levee for the remainder of my walk, both of us continuing the inspection together while staying alert for any repeat of the sound, neither of us saying much beyond the practical business of finishing the structural assessment we were both still responsible for completing regardless of whatever else might be happening out in the flooded timber. It came twice more over the following hour, each time following a period of splashing, each time fading after several seconds without any visual confirmation of a source despite our combined effort to spot something with 2 headlamps sweeping the water, working in coordination to cover more of the visible surface than either of us could have managed alone. My partner, a hydrologist with almost as much field experience as I had at the time, was careful and methodical in how she approached the whole situation, treating it the way she'd treat any unusual field observation worth documenting properly rather than dismissing or overreacting to. She made a point of noting the approximate compass bearing toward each occurrence, the time elapsed between the splashing and the moan, and any other ambient conditions that might be relevant, the kind of careful, almost clinical documentation that I think, in hindsight, did more to keep both of us functional and calm during that hour than either of us would have managed working from instinct alone. We finished the inspection segment without further incident, returned to the camp trailer, and discussed what we'd heard at length before either of us tried to sleep, working through the obvious explanations. A large alligator, which does occur in that river system, though less commonly than further south, possibly vocalizing during the disruption of flood conditions, or some kind of acoustic effect produced by water moving through standing timber under specific conditions that neither of us had personally encountered before despite years of collective experience along that levee system. We also considered, briefly, whether the sound could be some kind of distorted, distant industrial noise carrying unusually far across open water under the specific atmospheric conditions of that particular night, though neither of us could identify a plausible source for any industrial activity that far from the nearest developed area. And the timing relative to the splashing made that explanation feel like a stretch even as we floated it. Neither explanation fully satisfied either of us, though we both noted, deliberately, that we weren't prepared to commit to anything more dramatic than uncertainty, The appropriately cautious position for two people whose professional credibility depends on careful, evidence-based assessment rather than speculation. A standard we both held ourselves to instinctively, even in a conversation that neither of us expected anyone else to ever scrutinize closely. We finished our rotation without further incidents of that specific kind, though both of us noted in our personal logs, separate from the official inspection records, the general unease that particular stretch of levee had produced beyond what either of us typically experienced doing similar work elsewhere in the district. A private record neither of us had any particular plan for beyond simply wanting some documentation that didn't rely entirely on memory years down the line. I mentioned the experience, several months later, to a longtime Levee district employee nearing retirement, a man who'd worked flood control in that exact region for almost 4 decades, and who had a reputation among younger staff for knowing more unofficial history about the Levee system than any official record contained. The kind of institutional memory that exists only in the heads of people who've spent their entire careers in one specific place and never bothered, or never had reason, to write any of it down formally. He listened to my account without much visible reaction until I described the specific quality of the moaning sound, at which point he asked, directly, whether I'd been working the segment near the old river bend where a now-abandoned river town had once stood before changing river channels and repeated flooding led to its slow abandonment across the early 20th century. A level of geographic specificity in his question that told me immediately he wasn't simply humoring an odd story from a younger colleague. When I confirmed the general location matched, he told me that stretch of Levee and Bata Forest had a quiet but persistent reputation among longtime district staff, going back at least as far as his own earliest years on the job, of unexplained sounds reported during high water events specifically, never during normal river stages, always involving some version of the moaning quality I described, always associated with splashing that never resolved into a visible source despite repeated attempts to spot one. He said the connection to the abandoned river town wasn't something he could substantiate with any documented evidence, simply an association that had developed informally among staff over the decades, given that most of the reported incidents occurred along the stretch of levee closest to where that town's former footprint would have been before the river and successive floods erased almost all physical trace of it, down to the foundations themselves, which according to old survey records heat, once reviewed for an unrelated infrastructure project, had been entirely reclaimed by the river channel sometime in the 1930s. He told me he'd experienced something similar himself, decades earlier, early in his own career, during another major flood event, and that he'd never fully resolved it to his own satisfaction despite extensive professional experience with the genuine, mundane sounds that flooded Bata Forest produces under various conditions. He said the sound he remembered had the same essential quality I described, low, sustained, distinctly different from any animal vocalization he was otherwise familiar with from decades of fieldwork in that exact ecosystem, and that he'd heard it on 2 separate nights of the same rotation, always preceded by the same heavy, deliberate splashing I'd described myself, a detail he offered without my having mentioned it first, which struck me, hearing it, with the same quiet weight that Curtis's matching detail about an unexplained smell had carried in an entirely different story I'd later hear from a different friend in a different line of work altogether. I asked him whether he had any theory about what specifically connected the sound to the lost town, beyond the rough geographic overlap. He said he genuinely didn't, and that he'd long ago stopped trying to construct an explanation that satisfied him, settling instead into the same kind of professional acceptance that seems to characterize how most experienced field staff eventually handle genuinely unresolved phenomena in this line of work. Noted, taken seriously enough to mention quietly to trusted colleagues, but never escalated into anything requiring formal explanation, since the district's actual mandate concerns structural levee integrity rather than unexplained acoustic phenomena in adjacent flooded forest. I've continued working that same levee system in the years since, including several more major flood events that required overnight monitoring rotations along that same general stretch, and I haven't heard anything quite like that again, though I notice, now, a particular attentiveness during high water nights specifically, a kind of listening I didn't carry before that one rotation, for a sound that, by every account I've since gathered from longtime staff, seems to surface only when the river rises high enough to flood ground that, more than a century ago, briefly held a town that no longer exists in any form beyond the institutional memory of people who've spent their careers walking the levee that now stands where that town's edge would once have been. I've also, in the years since, done some informal research of my own into the abandoned town the retiring employee mentioned, mostly through old county records and a handful of historical society publications focused on towns lost to the river's shifting channel over the past century and a half, a more common fate along that stretch of the Mississippi than most people outside the region realize. What I found confirmed the basic outline he'd given me: a small river community, several hundred residents at its peak in the late 1800s, gradually abandoned across several decades of worsening flood damage and channel migration that eventually put the entire original town site underwater more or less permanently, with no formal mass casualty event recorded in connection with its abandonment. Simply a slow, generation-long depopulation as families relocated to higher, more stable ground further from the river's reach. That absence of any documented tragedy is, in its own way, the detail I find hardest to reconcile with everything else about this account. There's no dramatic flood disaster, no recorded drowning, nothing in the historical record that would obviously explain why that specific stretch of flooded forest might produce an unexplained sound during high water decades after the town itself disappeared. I don't have a theory that accounts for that gap, and neither, as far as I know, does anyone else who spent a career working that same levee system and occasionally hearing the same unexplained sound drift across the water on the particular nights when the river rises high enough to remember, in whatever sense water and flooded ground can be said to remember anything at all, exactly where that town once stood. My partner and I have stayed in occasional professional contact in the years since that rotation, even after she eventually moved on to a different position with a different agency, and we still bring up that night whenever our paths cross at a regional flood control conference or some other industry gathering, usually in the same careful, measured tone we used discussing it that first night in the camp trailer. Neither of us has ever needed the other to commit to a firmer explanation than what the bare facts support, and I think that mutual restraint, more than anything else, is what's allowed the memory to stay vivid without curdling into either dismissal or exaggeration over the years since. I've also come to appreciate, the longer I do this work, how much of flood control hydrology already requires a comfortable relationship with uncertainty and unresolved questions, given how much about river behavior during genuinely extreme events remains difficult to predict with full confidence, even using the best modeling tools the field currently has available. In that sense, carrying one specific unresolved field experience alongside the broader, more general uncertainty that defines this profession hasn't felt like as significant a departure from normal practice as it might in a field that prizes complete, confident explanation as the only acceptable outcome of careful observation. The district itself has no formal awareness of any of this, as far as I'm aware, no documented pattern in any official incident log, simply the kind of informal institutional memory that exists quietly among longtime field staff, and that gets passed along only when circumstances and trust align closely enough for someone to risk sharing it. I've since become, by virtue of seniority alone, one of the people newer hydrologists occasionally come to with exactly this kind of question, and I've found myself, more than once, in the same position my own retiring colleague once occupied, weighing how much institutional history to share with someone too new to the district to have heard any of it on their own. I usually wait, the same way he did with me, until something in their own account suggests they're ready to hear it, rather than offering it as a story that might color how they experienced their own first major flood rotation along that same remote, water-dominated stretch of Levee. It's a small, deliberate kind of professional inheritance, passed carefully from one generation of district staff to the next, in a place where the river itself has already erased almost every other trace of what once stood along that particular bend. What the river took from that town site physically, the institutional memory of this district has, in its own quiet way, kept alive far longer than any official record ever did. And so the listening continues, season after high water season, whether or not it ever produces an answer. The Overlook. I've worked seasonally as a backcountry EMT for a search and rescue team based out of a county in the Colorado high country for almost 10 years now, responding to incidents ranging from routine ankle injuries on popular day hike trails to multi-day search operations for overdue or missing backcountry travelers in genuinely remote terrain. The job requires a comfort with isolated, often dangerous environments that most people never experience, frequently at night, frequently in weather that would keep any reasonable person indoors, since emergencies don't wait for convenient conditions. And over the years, I've developed a professional relationship with that high-elevation terrain that's considerably more intimate than most recreational backcountry travelers ever achieve, knowing not just the popular routes, but the obscure drainages, the unmarked approaches, and the specific hazards of dozens of search areas across the county. This was 4 years ago, a multi-day search operation for a solo hiker who'd failed to check in after an overdue return from a remote alpine route, the kind of operation that pulls together volunteers and professional staff from across several agencies, working a coordinated grid search across difficult, high-elevation terrain that takes real time to cover properly, even with a full team. With Search Command coordinating multiple teams simultaneously across different sectors of a search area. That, in this particular case, spans several connected drainages and well over a dozen square miles of genuinely rugged alpine terrain. I was assigned, along with 2 other team members, to search a specific drainage that included a notable overlook point, a rocky outcrop with a clear view down into the basin below, a logical spot for any hiker following that route to have stopped, and therefore a priority location in our search grid. We reached the Overlook on the second day of the search, late afternoon, finding no sign of the missing hiker, but noting it as cleared in our search log before continuing our assigned route deeper into the drainage, conducting the kind of thorough visual sweep that search protocol requires at every priority location regardless of how likely or unlikely it seems to actually yield the subject. We made camp that night close to a mile beyond the Overlook, in a spot chosen more for its proximity to our next day's search area than for any particular appeal, a flat bench above a stream that gave us reasonable access to water and a defensible site for the kind of overnight stay that search operations require when the terrain makes a return to base camp impractical each night, the kind of efficient, purely functional camp selection that becomes second nature after enough multi-day operations in similarly demanding terrain. Sometime after midnight, one of my teammates, a volunteer named Mark with close to 15 years of search and rescue experience, woke me to report he'd seen a light at the Overlook we'd cleared earlier that day, a single, steady point of illumination roughly a mile distant and several hundred feet above our camp's elevation, visible clearly against the dark mass of the ridge behind it. Mark is, by reputation within our team, one of the most reliably level-headed people we have, someone who's talked plenty of newer or more anxious volunteers through their own moments of backcountry uncertainty over the years without ever showing much of that uncertainty himself, which made the specific urgency in his voice that night register with both of us immediately as something worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Given that we were actively searching for a missing person, This was immediately significant information rather than simply a strange observation, and we radioed it in to Search Command right away, reporting a possible sighting that needed follow-up, describing the light's exact position relative to known terrain features as precisely as we could manage from memory of the Overlook's layout we'd cleared just hours earlier. Search Command directed us to investigate at first light rather than attempting a night approach over technical terrain we hadn't scouted in darkness, a reasonable and standard operational decision given the very real risk of a rescuer becoming a second subject of the search through an unnecessary nighttime accident. A risk our team takes extremely seriously given more than one close call in the organization's history involving exactly that kind of well-intentioned but poorly judged nighttime approach. We watched the light from our camp for the remainder of that night in shifts, documenting its behavior as carefully as the circumstances allowed. It remained steady, unmoving, for almost 2 hours before disappearing without any visible fade. The same abrupt, fade-free disappearance I'd later hear described by an entirely different person in an entirely different context involving a similarly remote backcountry light. During those 2 hours, none of us slept particularly well, taking turns watching the light through a pair of binoculars one teammate happened to have brought along. Noting that it showed no flicker or movement consistent with a campfire, no the rhythmic on-off pattern of a signaling device, simply a fixed, steady point exactly where Mark had first spotted it, holding its position with a consistency that, the longer we watched, felt increasingly difficult to attribute to any obvious, mundane source. At first light, our team made the technical approach to the Overlook, a climb that took close to 90 minutes given the terrain, expecting to find some sign of the missing hiker, a headlamp, a bivouac, anything that would explain a light at that exact location overnight. We approached carefully and methodically, the way any search team would when there's a genuine possibility of finding the subject of their search, calling out periodically as we climbed and watching for any response. Our radios opened to Search Command the entire way in case we needed to call in a medical response quickly. We found nothing. No equipment, no sign of recent human presence beyond our own tracks from the previous afternoon, no indication that anyone had been at that Overlook since our own team had cleared it the day before, the morning light revealing nothing but bare rock, scattered alpine vegetation, and the same expansive view down into the basin that had made the spot a logical search priority in the first place. We reported the negative finding to Search Command and continued our assigned search pattern for the remainder of that day, eventually learning, 2 days later, that the missing hiker had been located by a different team in a completely different drainage, alive but injured, having taken a wrong turn early in his route that put him miles from where any of us had been searching. The light at the Overlook, whatever it had been, had no connection to the actual subject of our search, a conclusion that left all three of us with an unresolved observation that had nonetheless been treated, appropriately, as operationally significant in the moment, exactly the kind of careful, take it seriously until proven otherwise response that search and rescue protocol requires regardless of how an individual's sighting ultimately resolves. I mentioned the experience afterward to our search team's longtime incident commander, a woman with over 25 years of search and rescue experience in that same county, someone whose judgment the entire team trusts implicitly given how many genuinely difficult operational decisions she'd made correctly over the decades. Expecting either a mundane explanation involving another hiking party we'd simply missed in our search grid, or a dismissal of the whole thing as understandable confusion during a high-stress, sleep-deprived operation. Instead, she asked, carefully, whether the light had been at that specific Overlook, naming it before I had, a level of geographic precision that told me she had some particular reason for asking before I'd finished my own description, her tone shifting noticeably from casual professional interest to something more deliberate and careful. When I confirmed it was, she told me that Overlook had a documented pattern, going back through at least 4 other search operations she was personally aware of across her own tenure, of reported lights seen there at night by search teams working that drainage, never with any explanation found despite repeated investigation, never connected to the actual subject of whatever search was underway at the time. She said the pattern was well known enough among senior team members that it had become something close to institutional knowledge, mentioned to newer volunteers carefully, usually only after they had had their own experience with it firsthand. In much the same way I imagined she was now choosing to share it with me, treating the disclosure as something earned through direct experience rather than simply passed along as idle trivia. She told me she'd seen the light herself once, early in her own career, during a search operation in winter conditions that made a night investigation entirely out of the question, and that by the time her team was able to approach the Overlook the following morning, fresh snow had fallen overnight, meaning any tracks that might have explained the light's presence the night before would have been erased regardless of whether they'd existed. She said that detail, the convenient timing of conditions that prevented either an immediate investigation or a clean morning after check, had always struck her as either a remarkable coincidence or something else she'd never quite been willing to name directly, a hesitation in her voice that told me, even in that moment, she'd thought about this far more than she was choosing to share with me all at once. She described her own night watching the light in considerable detail, recalling specifically that it had appeared at almost exactly the same time of night as ours had, close to midnight, and had persisted for what she remembered as a similar duration before vanishing. Though she admitted memory across more than 2 decades made her less than fully confident in the precise timing matching ours as closely as it seemed to in the moment we were discussing it. She said what she remembered most clearly wasn't the light itself, but the specific quality of unease that settled over her own search team that night, a feeling she described as different from ordinary operational stress, something closer to the sense of being watched from a great distance by something that had no interest in being found. I should say a bit more about the Overlook itself, since its physical character is part of why it functions so naturally as both a search priority and, apparently, a recurring site for this kind of unexplained observation. It sits at a natural break in the terrain, a rocky shoulder that any reasonably experienced hiker following that drainage would likely be drawn to for the view alone, exposed on 3 sides with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on the basin-facing edge, the kind of dramatic, photogenic spot that shows up disproportionately often in trip reports and informal trail descriptions for that route. Its visibility from a considerable distance, the same quality that made Mark's sighting from our camp possible in the first place, is simply a function of how exposed and elevated the outcrop is relative to the surrounding terrain, with almost nothing nearby tall enough to obstruct a clear line of sight to it from several different directions and elevations within the broader drainage. I asked her whether she had a theory connecting the Overlook's reputation to anything specific in that drainage's history. She said she'd looked into it once, years earlier. Out of the same compulsive curiosity, I imagine drove my own later research, digging through old county archives and informal search and rescue records that predated any kind of digital documentation, and found a brief, poorly documented account of a search operation decades before her own tenure began for a different missing hiker in roughly the same area, who was never found despite weeks of searching, one of a small handful of genuinely unresolved missing person cases in that county's search and rescue history, a fact she noted with the particular gravity of someone who'd spent her entire career trying to ensure that exact outcome happened as rarely as humanly possible. She was careful to say she had no way of confirming any direct connection between that old case and the Overlook's pattern of reported lights, and that she'd never pursued the question further than that initial bit of research, treating it instead as one of the small number of things in a long search and rescue career that simply never resolve, regardless of how much careful, professional attention you're willing to give them. She added, almost as an afterthought, that in her experience, the people who eventually accept that some things in this line of work simply don't resolve tend to last longer in the role than those who insist on chasing every loose thread to a satisfying conclusion, a piece of hard-won professional wisdom I've thought about often in the years since, in context well beyond just this one unresolved overlook, including more than once during difficult, multi-day operations where the eventual outcome simply never reached the kind of clear resolution that would let everyone involved feel they'd done enough. I've worked several more search operations in that same general drainage in the years since, including 2 that required overnight camps within sight of that same overlook, and I haven't seen the light again myself, though I notice, now, a specific kind of attention I pay to that particular outcrop whenever our search pattern brings us anywhere near it, a habit none of my newer teammates seem to share, since none of them have yet had the experience that would explain it to them the way mine was eventually explained to me. I found myself, more than once on those subsequent operations, glancing toward that ridgeline during the quieter hours of an overnight camp, half expecting and half hoping not to see that same steady point of light reappear, an ambivalence I've never quite managed to resolve in either direction. I still do this work every season, still respond to genuine emergencies in terrain that demands the kind of careful, methodical attention that search and rescue requires, and I haven't let one unresolved night change how seriously I take the actual, documented dangers of backcountry search work, the avalanche risk, the technical terrain, the genuine medical emergencies that make up the overwhelming majority of what our team actually responds to in any given season. The light at that overlook remains, for me, a separate category of experience entirely, something I hold alongside the practical realities of the job rather than letting it interfere with how I approach the work itself. I've talked with Mark a handful of times since that operation, usually briefly, usually when something during a later search brings the memory back into conversation naturally rather than either of us deliberately raising it. He's told me, more than once, that he still thinks about the specific quality of that light's disappearance, the complete absence of any fade or flicker, more than almost any other detail from a search and rescue career that's given him plenty of genuinely strange things to remember over the years. Neither of us has ever pushed the conversation toward a firmer conclusion than what we already have, the same restraint our incident commander modeled for both of us that first time any of us discussed it openly. But I think about that light often, steady and unmoving for almost 2 hours before vanishing without a trace, at a location that, by every account collected across decades of search operations in that drainage, seems to produce the same unexplained signal to different teams, in different years, searching for different people, none of whom that light has ever once, as far as anyone can determine, actually helped to find. It remains, for me and apparently for everyone else who's encountered it across the years, exactly what our incident commander said it was. One of the small number of things in this line of work that simply never resolve, no matter how much careful, professional attention you're willing to give it. Search and rescue work, more than most jobs, teaches you to hold 2 things simultaneously without forcing them to resolve into a single tidy narrative. The practical, procedural reality of the operation itself, governed by protocol and careful risk assessment, and the personal, unresolved residue that certain incidents leave behind regardless of how cleanly the official record closes them out. The Overlook light belongs entirely to that second category for me, filed alongside a handful of other genuinely strange moments from a decade of this work that I've learned not to need an explanation for in order to keep doing the job well. I suspect every long-tenured member of our team carries at least one experience like it, quietly, the way our incident commander clearly has for over 2 decades, brought out only when the circumstances and the company feel right enough to share it. Our team has, informally, started referring to it simply as the Watcher Light, among the small group of senior staff who know the full history, a name nobody officially coined, but that's settled into casual use over the years the same way most institutional nicknames do, through repetition rather than deliberate decision. It's not a name we use around newer volunteers, and it's not a name that appears anywhere in any official log or report. But among those of us who've sat through a night watching it from a distance, it's become a useful, almost affectionate kind of shorthand for something none of us has ever managed to explain, reduce, or fully set aside. I don't expect that name, or anything else about this account, to satisfy anyone looking for a clean answer. I don't have one to give. What I have instead is a decade of careful, professional observation, 2 reliable witnesses beyond myself, and an institutional memory stretching back over 25 years that all point toward the same simple, unresolved fact. Something appears at that overlook on certain nights, watches whatever search happens to be underway in that drainage, and disappears before anyone can determine what it was or why it was there. The Powerline Cut. I've worked for almost 12 years as a lineman for a rural electric cooperative, covering a service territory in eastern Kentucky that includes some of the most remote, difficult terrain our utility serves, long transmission corridors that cut straight through unbroken forest for miles at a stretch, accessible mostly by maintenance roads that the cooperative keeps cleared specifically for line access. Storm response work routinely puts crews out in that corridor at all hours, since down lines don't wait for daylight. And over the years I've spent more nights working isolated stretches of that cut than I could easily count, in conditions ranging from routine seasonal maintenance to genuine emergency response after the kind of major weather events that knock out power across entire counties at once. The transmission corridor itself is a distinctive feature of that landscape. A 150-foot swath of cleared ground running in a straight, deliberate line wherever the engineering required it, regardless of how steeply that line happens to cut across ridges and hollows that would otherwise see almost no human presence at all. The cooperative maintains it by mowing and selective clearing on a rotating schedule, keeping the corridor itself open while the forest on either side grows up dense and largely untouched right to the treeline, creating a sharp, almost unnatural boundary between cleared utility ground and unbroken Appalachian hardwood forest that stretches for miles in every direction beyond it. This was 3 years ago, a major ice storm that had knocked out power across a wide swath of our territory, putting every available crew on extended shifts working through a backlog of down lines and damaged structures. That particular storm had been bad enough that the cooperative called in mutual aid crews from 3 neighboring utilities, and even with that additional support, our own crews were working stretches well past 16 hours at a time, the kind of sustained, exhausting effort that storm response in that region demands every few years when conditions align badly enough. I was assigned, along with one other lineman, to a stretch of transmission corridor that runs through a particularly remote section of national forest land, terrain steep and heavily wooded enough that the Powerline Cut itself is the only meaningfully open ground for miles, a corridor maybe 150 feet wide running dead straight over several ridgelines, accessible only by a single maintenance road that the ice storm had left in rough enough condition that even our 4-wheel drive truck struggled in places. We'd been working since before dawn, repairing storm damage on foot and with a bucket truck where the access road allowed, and by full dark we were still several structures away from finishing our assigned stretch, working under headlamps and truck-mounted lighting in conditions that made every task slower and more deliberate than usual given the ice still coating most surfaces. Every step on the access road itself requiring careful attention given how easily a slip could turn a long, isolated shift into a genuine medical emergency miles from the nearest help. My partner, a lineman named Curtis with almost 20 years more experience than me, was up in the bucket working on a damaged crossarm while I handled ground support when he called down to ask if I'd seen anyone else out in the cut. I told him no, that we were the only crew assigned to that stretch and dispatch hadn't mentioned anyone else working nearby, since the staging coordinator typically gave us a heads-up over the radio whenever another crew's assignment overlapped or ran adjacent to ours, a courtesy that hadn't come through that night. He said he'd seen something moving along the treeline at the edge of the corridor, maybe 200 yards downslope from our position, briefly illuminated by the truck's work lights before disappearing back into the timber, tall enough and upright enough that his first assumption had been another lineman from a different crew checking on our progress. Though he admitted, even as he described it, that the shape hadn't moved quite like a person walking normally would, something about the stride and the way it had carried itself that he couldn't quite reconcile with an ordinary human gait despite trying, in the moment, to fit it into exactly that explanation. We finished the repair and moved the truck to the next damaged structure, putting some distance between us and wherever Curtis had seen the movement, and I didn't think much more about it until close to an hour later, when I caught my own glimpse of something at the treeline, this time clearly enough that I could describe it with more confidence than Curtis had managed. It was tall, considerably taller than either of us, moving with an upright but oddly fluid gait along the edge of the cleared corridor, staying just inside the treeline rather than crossing into the open cut itself, which struck me immediately as a kind of deliberate caution that didn't match how I'd expect wildlife to behave around our truck's bright work lights. Since most animals in that terrain either flee a bright light source entirely or freeze in place rather than continuing a steady, purposeful movement parallel to it the way this shape did. I want to be specific about the lighting conditions because they matter for how confident I am in what I actually saw. Our truck carries a substantial work light array specifically designed to illuminate a wide work area at night, more than sufficient to throw real, useful light a couple hundred feet into the surrounding terrain under good conditions, and that night, with the ice on the ground and in the canopy reflecting and scattering additional light, visibility along the corridor edge was considerably better than an ordinary moonless night would have allowed. I had, in other words, a better than typical view for that kind of fleeting wildlife sighting, which is part of why the shape's clarity and the wrongness of its proportions stuck with me as firmly as they did, rather than fading into the kind of vague, second-hand uncertainty that so many similar accounts eventually settle into with time. I mentioned what I'd seen to Curtis, who confirmed it matched his own earlier sighting closely enough that we both stopped working for a moment to actually discuss it rather than simply noting it and moving on. We agreed, without much debate, to keep working but to stay closer together for the remainder of the shift, a practical decision that neither of us framed explicitly as being about safety from whatever we'd seen, though I think we both understood that's exactly what it was. The shape appeared twice more over the following 2 hours, always at a similar distance, always staying inside the treeline, never approaching the cut itself or showing any interest in our truck or our work beyond what seemed like simple, sustained observation. By the third sighting, Curtis, who I should say is about as unflappable a person as I've worked with in 12 years at the cooperative, a man who'd talked me through my own first genuinely dangerous live-line incident early in my career without so much as raising his voice, admitted he'd had a similar experience years earlier, working a different but nearby stretch of the same general transmission corridor during another storm response, also at night, also involving a tall shape observed at a distance along a treeline that never crossed into open ground. He told me he'd never reported it to the cooperative or mentioned it to more than 1 or 2 trusted coworkers, for the same reasons most people in this kind of situation cite: the worry that it would affect how seriously colleagues took him professionally, weighed against an experience he was confident enough in to want to share once the circumstances genuinely called for it, the way our shared night was clearly doing by that third sighting. He said his own sighting had included a detail I hadn't mentioned yet myself: an overwhelming smell, sudden and strong, something he described as a wet, musky odor that arrived and faded within a couple of minutes, with no obvious source he could identify at the time or since, a smell he said he'd never encountered before or after that one earlier night despite years of working similar terrain in every season. When I told him I'd noticed something similar during my own second sighting that night, a brief, strong smell I'd attributed at the time to some dead animal nearby in the timber, possibly a deer carcass from the storm or predator activity, He went quiet for a long moment before saying that detail matching between our two separate experiences, years apart, bothered him more than anything else about either encounter. He explained that he'd spent considerable time, in the years since his own sighting, trying to identify a plausible source for that smell using his own knowledge of the local wildlife, and even asking a wildlife officer he knew socially, without ever landing on an explanation that fully satisfied him, since the closest comparisons he'd found, certain large predator musk glands, decomposition at specific stages, never quite matched the specific quality of what he remembered smelling that night. I asked him, given how much time had passed since his own original sighting, whether he'd ever told our crew supervisor or documented it formally in any way, even informally. He said no, that the closest he'd come was a brief, deliberately vague mention to one other longtime lineman a few years back, framed as an odd story rather than a serious report, and that the other man's reaction, going quiet, then admitting he'd heard something similar from yet another retired lineman who'd worked that corridor decades earlier, had been enough to convince Curtis that whatever was happening out there wasn't unique to his own one experience, even though he'd never pursued the matter any further than that single conversation. We finished our assigned repairs that night without further incident, reported back to the staging area close to 4 a.m, both of us thoroughly exhausted in the particular way that comes from a 16-hour shift compounded by something neither of us had fully processed yet, and neither of us formally documented the sightings beyond a brief, vague mention to our crew supervisor the following week, framed carefully enough that it wouldn't read as anything beyond an odd story from a long storm shift, the kind of thing you mention almost as comic relief after a grueling stretch of work rather than something you'd want logged in any official incident report. Our supervisor, a practical man not given to entertaining much beyond the literal facts of a repair job, laughed it off in the moment, though I noticed he didn't immediately change the subject the way I might have expected, lingering on the story a beat longer than the joke alone would have warranted. I've since asked, cautiously, a handful of other linemen who've worked that same general corridor over the years whether they'd experienced anything similar, framing the questions vaguely enough at first that I wasn't leading anyone toward a specific answer, only sharpening my questions once someone's initial response suggested they might have something to share. I've gotten 2 more accounts, secondhand but specific enough in their details, tall shape, treeline only, strong unexplained odor, that I no longer consider what Curtis and I saw an isolated incident specific to one unusual night. One of those accounts came from a retired lineman in his 70s who'd worked that same territory decades before either Curtis or I started with the cooperative, who described, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask him directly over coffee at a retiree gathering, almost exactly the same combination of details from a storm response sometime in the late 1980s. On a stretch of corridor he was confident was within a few miles of where Curtis and I had our own experience. He told me he'd assumed, at the time, that it had simply been a very tall, unusually built man, possibly someone living rough in the surrounding national forest land, which does happen occasionally in that region, and that he'd never given the smell much thought beyond a passing assumption about dead wildlife nearby. The same explanation I'd reached for myself before Curtis's account complicated it. When I described our own night to him in more detail, including the specific quality of the smell Curtis had described, he admitted that his own memory of it, decades on, matched closely enough that he found himself genuinely unsettled revisiting a story he'd otherwise filed away as an unremarkable curiosity from early in his career. I still work that same service territory, still respond to storm damage in that same remote corridor when conditions require it, and I haven't let what happened change how I do my job in any meaningful way, since the actual hazards of line work, live wires, falling limbs, working at height in bad weather, remain far more immediate and far better documented than anything connected to what Curtis and I saw that night, and a lineman who led an unexplained sighting from one storm shift years ago govern his approach to genuinely dangerous, Well-understood occupational hazards wouldn't last long in this line of work regardless of how unsettling that one night had been. But I notice, now, a heightened attentiveness to the treeline whenever I'm working that particular stretch after dark, a kind of peripheral vigilance I didn't used to carry, watching for a tall, upright shape that seems content, by every account I've gathered since, to simply observe from just inside the trees, never crossing into the open corridor that decades of utility maintenance have kept clear, as if some unspoken boundary exists there that whatever moves along that treeline has no interest in testing. I've thought about that boundary more than almost any other detail from that night. The consistency of it across every account I've collected, spanning decades and multiple separate sightings by people with no contact with each other at the time of their own experiences. Whatever it is, it appears content to remain just inside the timber, watching crews like ours go about the genuinely mundane, technical business of restoring power to people's homes, never once, as far as anyone has reported to me, making any move to cross into the cleared ground where our trucks and our lights and our actual work exist. I sometimes wonder whether that boundary says more about the corridor itself than about whatever moves along its edge, whether decades of maintained, cleared right-of-way have simply become, in some functional sense, a kind of demarcation line that something out there has learned, or always understood, not to cross, the same way a deer learns the edge of a highway shoulder without anyone teaching it directly. Curtis and I have talked about that night maybe half a dozen times in the years since, usually during long, quiet stretches of a slow shift when the conversation naturally drifts towards stories from the job, and neither of us has ever pushed the conversation toward a firmer conclusion than the bare facts allow. We know what we saw, we know what we smelled, and we know that a retired lineman with decades more experience than either of us described something close enough to make coincidence feel like an increasingly uncomfortable explanation. Beyond that, we've both learned to leave the question exactly where it sits, unresolved, the way you eventually have to leave a lot of things that remote, isolated work turns up over the course of a long enough career. I've also thought, more than once, about the practical implications of a tall, upright presence apparently using that transmission corridor's treeline as a kind of regular travel route, given how much of our crew's work happens precisely along that boundary between cleared right-of-way and unbroken timber. Line work requires us to be at that exact edge constantly, trimming vegetation, accessing structures, repairing storm damage, which means that whatever moves along that treeline and whatever crews like Curtis's and mine do for a living are operating in close, sustained proximity to each other on a near-daily basis across the cooperative's full-service territory, with apparently very little friction between the two beyond the occasional, unsettling sighting during a long night shift. That coexistence, if that's the right word for it, is part of what makes the whole account feel less like an isolated anomaly and more like a quiet, ongoing feature of working that particular landscape, the same way longtime farmers in remote areas often describe a similarly understated, practical relationship with wildlife or unexplained phenomena on land they've worked for decades. You don't necessarily need to resolve or explain something to develop a working accommodation with it, and I think that's ultimately where Curtis and I, and the handful of other linemen who've shared similar accounts with us since, have all independently landed. I mentioned earlier that I've gathered 2 more secondhand accounts from other linemen over the years, and I want to be precise about how carefully I've held those, since secondhand stories in any close-knit profession can drift and accumulate detail in the retelling in ways that make them less reliable than they initially seem. Both of the accounts I collected came from sources I trust personally, told to me directly rather than relayed through a third party, and both included the same core combination of details that Curtis and I experienced ourselves: a tall, upright shape, treeline only, and that same distinctive, unexplained odor, without my having described those specific details to either source before they offered them on their own. That kind of unprompted detail matching, repeated now across 4 separate accounts spanning decades, is the thing I find hardest to set aside whenever I try to talk myself back toward a fully mundane explanation for any single one of them in isolation.